All right, everyone, we are moving right into the fun stuff here. So we're going to start looking at file collaboration in Microsoft 365. So we're going to be looking at SharePoint, OneDrive, and even a little bit of Teams. But let's dive right in here. So first and foremost, file collaboration inside of Microsoft 365. Remember, I always try to adhere to Microsoft Mocha concepts. So first of all, what is it? What is file collaboration? Now, again, this is a definition. This is just my definition, is generating, editing, and working together on knowledge created by users in an organization. Now, what the heck what's knowledge? Well, knowledge is anything. Think of this as traditional. There used to be a term called knowledge worker. These are people that generate knowledge. Now, what is knowledge? Again, let's define that. Well, knowledge really could be, again, we used that example in the initial discussion on this particular section here around the budget. Well, a budget, a spreadsheet, a policy, a procedure, any of those things that are essentially created and generated by users. So these are lots of different things, PDFs, reports, all of those things are knowledge created by users. Now, that's the purpose. That is traditionally the purpose for most office workers' jobs in some form or fashion, is that they have to generate and create knowledge. That's really it. That's the big piece. Now, let's start looking at when we're starting to generate this knowledge, well, what are some options that we have? But as we have done, and we're going to continue to do here, is we're going to start looking at some of the legacy ways of doing things and then show you what some of the more modern ways are. Now, I will tell you before I go on, is that this is where we're going to start seeing a lot of those stark differences in modern space, in the modern network here. So again, remember, the whole purpose of this course is to define what the modern network is. Well, that's one of the things that we're going to be doing here, because this one is going to shine much more than we will see ever, because this is a completely new way, fundamentally changing the way that we work and generate this knowledge. So let's jump in here first. Legacy network options. What do we have right now on our legacy area networks here? So if we were working inside of an office or even from home, remember, we got to look at that very fine line that happened in 2020. After that and before that. So if we look in the before that period here, these are the spaces and this is what we did. So in this instance here, we had SMB shares. Now these are going to be our traditional network file shares. So this is where the vast majority of our knowledge would exist for our organization. They would exist on file servers inside of our network. Well, here's the biggest problem with file shares inside of a network. They're inside of a network. The biggest problem is, in order to access this, I have to either do one of two things. One, I have to expose my file server directly to the internet, which, of course, that's a terrible idea. We would never, ever do that. The other option is I have to essentially come in through what's referred to as a VPN. And we talked about this before. VPNs, in my personal opinion, really are just an antiquated technology, and I'm not the biggest fan of them. So when we're looking at this here, we have to come in from a VPN. That's it. That's really the only ways that we can do this. So when we're looking at all of our file shares, our department shares, our personal shares, we'll talk about those, our H drives, which is a very common one. Why H? Does anybody know? Well, the big answer is because it's one of the next logical letters to choose, which is just funny. So H drives, and then we have I drives and T drives and all of these different letters. It doesn't matter what those truly are. But again, that's traditionally where we would store a lot of information. Now, again, the biggest problem is that when people start working from home, now they're going to come in through a VPN. And if I have a larger file, maybe it's a large report or something that gets printed out, I have to now drag that across the network and the VPN link just to access that file. And it is a nightmare. So all changes and everything I need to do get saved back over that link. I'm essentially rubber banding. I'm going back and forth between my local computer and the server and back and forth and back and forth. That's a nightmare. And that's incredibly inefficient when you really start thinking about it. The other problem is, and we've talked about this in the past as well, is really around the idea of storage. Again, we're generating all of this stuff, and where's it all going to sit? Well, it's going to sit on file shares. Do we have ways of, what are we going to store? How long are we going to store this for? Is it going to be there forever? Well, I guess another spoiler alert, for the most part, yes. That's what most organizations, they keep their data around forever from when it comes to files. But with that being said, we got to store this stuff, and now we got to pay for storage, and now we got to start looking at, oh gosh, well, we got to back it up. We got to have X and Y and Z. There's so many different things that we have to consider when we're doing this here. So I got to have servers for this storage. I got to do a lot. Okay, well, this is one way of doing it. Sure, that's not the only way, of course. We do also have the local computer storage or USB drives. Problem with this here is manyfold. Really, if I'm working on a local computer, this is probably one of the biggest problems that I've seen in the past is that I'm working on a laptop, let's just say, because it's easier. I don't have to VPN. I'm just working on my local computer. Well, what happens there? Let's just say that I'm working on the computer and I spill coffee all over the keyboard. What happened to that knowledge that I was working on? Guess what? It's lost. USB, same kind of concept there. If it's working or if it's lost, the USB drive itself gets lost. Or absolute worst case scenario, what if they get stolen? This is something that we talked a little bit about already based off of the in one of our other lectures there. But what happens if that computer gets stolen and all of that knowledge goes out the door with it? What if it was proprietary information or something? So, when it comes to local computer storage, this is very, very common. We see this a lot. Now, a lot of companies try to do things like folder redirection and such, which don't work when you're over the VPN link very well. It is going to bomb your network. We don't want to do that. So, obviously, we want to make it as best as possible. And finally, this is one, and I alluded to it a little bit, and the first lecture here is email. Oh boy. Email has really blown up in terms of what it was ever designed to be used for. And I will hold firm to this, is that email was never designed to be a storage repository. It was never supposed to put large attachments on it and collaborate off of files inside of email. It is so inefficient, and it just drives me crazy when I hear my customers say this, is that, hey, well, let's, again, using the budget discussion that I used before is, all right, here's the budget. Everybody send me your edits. Okay, so now we have created a copy of it on the server. Now, granted, we're talking about stubbing and all of those things, but, we've created a copy on that on the email server. Now, everybody has to create their own local copy and email it back to a person. So now what we have are 50 different files. And also, it has to be that one person there that is essentially kind of the steward or the custodian of it, and they have to enter all of the stuff inside of there. Talk about inefficient. That just makes my blood boil when I hear these types of things. Email was never designed to be a collaboration platform. It's a communication platform only. It can work in certain circumstances when I need to send an attachment or something outside of the organization. That makes perfect sense. But internally, inside of the organization, I should never, ever, ever, ever use it. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about email and where it fits in as well, or where it may not fit in as well for communications inside of the Teams section. But for now, these are traditionally where we have. Now, we do have some of these outliers here, and I'll be completely honest with you, this is a very real threat. One of the biggest problems is when we had, and I can tell you multiple times, off the top of my head, I can think of several, where I would be interviewing lines of business for an organization. And I would say, hey, how do you collaborate? How do you work today? And I'm talking to end users. This is a big deal here. We need to be able to not be afraid of our end users. They're people that work just like we do, and we need to be able to enable them. Empowerment. Remember, that's what we said. That's a big word. So when it's so difficult for them to do their jobs, through SMB shares, I have to connect through a VPN. The VPN's slow, it's inefficient, and it's very clunky. If I'm working on my local computer storage, maybe you blocked it off through some sort of policy or something. Or email is just starting to get filled up because I'm putting too many things on there. Well, where am I going to go next? Well, this is where we start encouraging, or not, hopefully don't encourage, but by doing these types of actions here, we're encouraging our users to use things, that dreaded shadow IT. We don't really like that term. That is a bad term, and that makes me feel very bad when I hear this. But every customer I've run into, well, not every, but most customers I run into, they do it. Why? Because it's easier for me to do my job if I use my own tools. Now, I'm putting corporate data on personal Dropboxes, boxes, Google Drives, whatever. That should, as a administrator, should terrify you, because that's nothing we ever want to do. So, what are our modern network options? We've looked at our legacy, and I don't want to beat a dead horse with these here, so let's continue on with the modern options. So, what do we have here? Well, we have OneDrive for Business. this fits the me space. Remember that in the Mocha concepts here is that this is the me space. I'm going to explain why it's the me space here in just a bit. So this is going to be very much your traditional personal share. Okay, OneDrive for Business is the individual user space. We're going to dive a little bit further into what OneDrive truly is, and when we start playing a lab, we're going to start looking at it. Now, the next piece that we have here, SharePoint Online. We have SharePoint on-premise. I did kind of eliminate that because a lot of customers don't necessarily use it. A lot of my customers don't use it in the correct form, or they don't have a dedicated SharePoint administrator or anything like that that is monitoring their on-premise farms, and it generally kind of falls apart over time. So again, SharePoint on-prem is certainly an option in the legacy network there, and it does help, but it is traditionally not as used as much because A, it's difficult, B, it requires a special resource, so most organizations forego it. So SharePoint Online here, we're fitting the we and them space. Okay, so we meaning the group base, and them meaning the SharePoint communication side of things. Now, when we're looking at team sites, this is what we're looking at. Now, again, don't get confused about the term team. Now, I will refer to team as a capital T team, which is a Microsoft team. This is in the Teams team. So again, team, it's team. I'm going to say team 1,000 times in this, at least. So team sites are going to be group storage. Okay, so this is going to be essentially what we would have maybe our department shares, or maybe shares that were for project-based or more short-term, and I use that in quotations because short-term is relative, of course. It could maybe only a couple of years, but it's a finite amount of time that this storage location is going to exist for. These are where we get SharePoint team sites, are SharePoint pieces. That's the collaboration side of it at the end of the day. Now, we also have Microsoft Teams to add, again, maybe a little bit more complexity into this. And I will be honest with you, this is not necessarily the easiest thing to comprehend. So, again, understand that not each one of these are definitive, meaning that I don't always put all of my personal stuff inside of my OneDrive. I don't always put all of my team or maybe project-based or department stuff inside of SharePoint or Teams or wherever. It really depends, and we'll start painting that picture a little bit better when we start talking about Teams and how it fits into it. But for right now, we're just going to talk about file collaboration. So these are our three main places. Now, Yammer could fit in here as well, but for the most part, it's not necessarily something that we would use as a storage repository. Okay, so this is really where we're going to store the stuff that we're generating. So I alluded to two things in our previous lecture around why the modern space inside of SharePoint is very important. There's two things. One, co-authoring. Now, what is this? It's the ability for multiple users to edit the same document at the same time. We can jump in, and we're going to work through this here. I'm going to demonstrate what this looks like in lab. But essentially what's going to happen here is that we're going to have co-authoring going on. Multiple users are going to be editing the same document at the same time. This seems like, this is kind of brain dead. Like, okay, this isn't like a mind-blowing thing. I am not lying when I say that, when I say this to my customers, that yes, we can have multiple people. And every one of them like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. That's such a fantastic thing. Why is it such a fantastic thing? Why are they so excited about this? It seems like everybody can do this. Google does this here. Well, in the various spaces, depending on where you are, a lot of this co-authoring stuff is we've been working with it for years, whether it be through Google Docs or whatever. But the big problem that this solves, that co-authoring solves, is this. And this is such a big one. And again, going back to the legacy side of things, document locking and access restrictions. This is the most obnoxious thing on the planet, and I hate this so much. This solves the document locking piece. So again, somebody opens up a document on a file share, okay? And, Sally's got it open and she's editing it. But I also need to access that same document. Remember, that exists on a file share. I am unable to open an editable copy of that document because she has it open and it's locked for editing. So we get this stupid pop-up that says so-and-so has this document open for editing. Now, that's not really that big of a deal when a person's actively working with it and you can get a hold of them or whatever. Well, what happens where I need to make a quick edit, I need to get this out the door, I need to get going with this here real quick. Well, Sally has it open for editing, she locked it for editing and then walked out for lunch and now it's still opening. Now, I have to either get onto Sally's computer, which hopefully she's following good practices and locks it before she walks away from it. But if not, then I get with IT, and I got to have IT go and essentially, take over that document and then allow me to do it. How inefficient is that? That's like 25, 30 minutes of effort for something that takes all of 5 seconds to make a change. This is a big deal in the corporate field, and I kid you not that this is a big deal. Being able to solve this problem is a big change. Now, access restrictions. This is another thing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this as this lecture goes on. Is the permission model. Okay, so I'm inside of a file share. How do I assign permissions? SMB, or we'll call it file share permissions, if you will. NTFS permissions is also another term for it. But as we're looking at these things on here, you're like, wow, that's a lot to really do it, because most of the time organizations have been using file shares file shares have been around since the beginning of Windows networking or Microsoft networking, to be completely honest with you. So at that point there, when we're looking at file shares, there's a good chance that organization has been doing that for 20 years. And they have 20 years worth of permissions and custom things and everything inside of all these custom permission sets and groups and everything inside of file shares. So it gets to be a nightmare. So we start breaking down inheritance and all of these. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But that's a huge piece of this as well. And this is probably one of the biggest stepping stones for our organizations that we'll call it I won't say a stepping stone, I'll say a hurdle, because it is a hurdle for organizations. But again, we'll talk more about that. So co-authoring solves a lot of problems just in this manner here. It's actually quite easy. Now, breaking along the lines, we have co-authoring was one of them. The next piece that I wanted to talk about was version history. Now, again, version history is, let's go back to that example where, hey, we made the budget, we emailed it out to 50 people. 50 people are editing their own individual copy and sending me 50 copies of that version, or of their version of all of their edits and changes. And essentially, I have to make sure that they're all merged and they're all working. What an inefficient thing. Well, version history here is that by co-authoring, we're solving that problem here. But with version history is we are able to save all major edits and minor edits too to a document from its initial creation. Now, any type of major edit would be something that would be a large edit, and that's traditionally when somebody puts a lot of information inside of a document, saves it, and closes it out. Another thing that you could potentially work through here are going to be minor edits. I made a couple of changes here and there and everywhere, and you'll see it. And this is really around the when we're looking at the version 1.0, well, 1 is the major and 0 here in this instance would be minor. And every time I make a minor edit, it's going to be 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, so on and so forth. And then we have major edits, which would be 2.0. And you can understand it going from there. But the best part about version history here is at any point in time with a couple clicks of a button, I can go in and revert a version back to whatever version I want. So let's just say we're on version 3. Sally comes in and accidentally deletes everything, and she saves it, and now it becomes version 4. So she accidentally deleted it all. Oops, my bad. Didn't mean to do that. Well, we got to recreate it all? No. A couple clicks of a button, we can revert back to our version 3.0 or whatever our last change was before Sally went in and hit the major edit and deleted everything. This allows us to be able to solve for that accidental deletion and document control. Now, we can also lock this as well. So we can say that, hey, this is the final edit, and if we need additional changes, you need to get with the owner of the document. So document control is a big deal, especially when we're looking at policies and procedures. We don't want people just going in and changing the policies and procedures, right? Of course, we want that to be, locked down and essentially controlled. So that's where we come down as version history. Big deal here. This is big. And of course, we're going to show you both of them on here. These are two big pieces that SharePoint allows us to do. Okay. Now, let's break down SharePoint and OneDrive. All right, so this is another very important piece. What's the difference between the two? Why can't I just store everything inside of OneDrive or everything inside of SharePoint? Well, let's look at it. So OneDrive for Business. What does it give you? What do we do with it? So initially, remember, OneDrive for Business is really fitting that personal category. Okay. Now, each license for every user that gets assigned OneDrive for Business license, they get 1 terabyte of personal storage. Now, this 1 terabyte of storage can go up to 5 terabytes per person. Not a good idea. I don't recommend it for most organizations. And the reason being is that there's this adage of we are all digital hoarders. And inside of an organization, when people are generating knowledge, they have that so you put a little fish in a big pond, and eventually that little fish will become a very big fish. But if you put a little fish in a little pond, it'll pretty much stay that size. Same concept applies here. So we get 1 terabyte of storage, which really, that's a tremendous amount of data. We're really thinking about it here. We can put 1 terabyte of personal storage, okay? Now, the cool part about this here, and we're going to do a deep dive here into the OneDrive for Business Sync client and what it can do, but when we look at the OneDrive for Business piece here, it's crazy. We can actually you have a 250 gig individual file limit storage on it. So in theory, we could fill up our 1 terabyte with 4 files inside of it, sure. I have never seen a 250 gig file that wasn't maybe like a PST or a video or something, but we're storing this stuff inside of our OneDrive. Okay, well, in the end, really when you break it down, no matter what, all right, and I just want to also preface with this, inside of Office 365, there are only really 2 places of which we can store data. The first is Exchange, and that's going to be our email, but there's also other things in there as well, with our calendars and some of our planner stuff, and also some Teams things get stored in there. But when we look at the other place that we can store it, it's really SharePoint. Now, it could be different flavors of SharePoint, but they're all SharePoint in the back end. So OneDrive for Business is SharePoint in the back end, but it is more, these are what used to be referred to as My Sites, and you can actually still see inside of the /my, inside of the URL, inside of your OneDrive for Business, you actually have a /my in it, which essentially just means that it's a OneDrive site. Now, OneDrive, again, as I said, is really designed for personal storage. So as we are working inside of our information, we have to store it into OneDrive. Now, are we just dragging and dropping? Do we have to upload to a web portal? Well, that's kind of annoying, right? Well, that's not the case. And remember, we got to think about this from the corporate standpoint. The OneDrive for Business Sync client is the lifeblood for OneDrive for Business. Okay? The OneDrive for Business Sync client is an application that sits on your computer and it synchronizes any changes to your local computer and vice versa. It's a bidirectional sync. Okay? And we're going to look at it far more in depth as we go through here, of course. We're going to look at it in the lab. But the OneDrive for Business Sync client is the lifeblood of it. Why? Because this allows me to work as an end user in my traditional File Explorer setting. Okay? Users are very comfortable with going to Windows File Explorer, browsing directories, and clicking and opening documents and doing things from there. That's what users are very comfortable doing. So we're going to give them that same space. Now, with the OneDrive for Business Sync client, we can do a lot with it. It changes. We can still do version history. We can do sharing, which I'll get to here in just a bit. We'll do sharing. We can do co-authoring. All of that stuff we can use. And the coolest part about it is that it natively integrates with all of the Office clients. So again, Word, PowerPoint, Excel, all of those integrate directly into OneDrive for Business Sync client. So I'm able to double click on a file, open it up in my thick client of Word, PowerPoint, Excel, edit it, close it out. All changes are synchronized, and we have a copy up in the cloud. And this is the cool part about it, is that essentially everything is in the cloud. The cloud is the source of truth. Remember when I gave a legacy instance of, hey, this computer, excuse me, my information that I'm generating is located on my local computer. Okay, well, the problem when that computer blows up or gets stolen or who knows what, well, all of the data goes with it. But if we're using the OneDrive for Business Sync client, all of that data is housed in the cloud. It's all in our OneDrive for Business site, synced automatically. So if our computer blows up, who cares? We'll just get a new computer. Now, luckily and hopefully, we are using some sort of maybe Intune or something, BitLocker or something on the computer device where the data in itself can be either wiped or has to be destroyed before it can be used via encryption, drive encryption or something like that. But at that point there, the data in its own right is safe because it's up in the cloud. And if, let's just say, we dropped coffee on it or whatever, again, we're still saved. Okay, and that doesn't matter. So when OneDrive for Business comes into play, the sync client is the lifeblood of it. We're going to look at it here as it goes because it's very important. Now, again, to answer the question, and this is the biggest piece here of OneDrive for Business versus SharePoint, where should I put the data? Well, you have to remember this, all right? OneDrive for Business is tied to a user account. I cannot stress why this is the reason why it's personal. Should never be used as a group share. I am not a big fan of using OneDrive as a group share. This should be just for kind of one and done type scenarios here. Okay, I'll tell you how I use OneDrive for Business for my customers. All right, so when I'm working inside of OneDrive for Business, we'll share things or whatever it may be, and if a customer needs to be able to download a document, I'll generate essentially a one-time link for them where they can go in, pull it, take the document, and then do what they will with it. Okay, that's really the big piece and what I use OneDrive for. But I don't really share it too frequently internally. Okay, and I'll explain why later on. But again, OneDrive for Business is tied to a user account and should never be used as a group share. And the reason being, and I've seen this so many times, is that people will create OneDrive and they'll share it out and it will turn into a quasi-department share. Okay. And we never ever want this because let's just say Sally shares out a whole bunch of her stuff to the accounting department. And she shares it all out to all of those people inside of there. Sally gets a new job, leaves the organization. Her account goes away. Guess what happened to all of that data that was inside of Sally's account along with all of the accounting share? Goodbye. All of it's gone now too. OneDrive's tied to user accounts and should never ever be used as a group share. Ever. Very important to understand that. All right. So let's just say we do want to potentially look at using SharePoint, a team site inside of SharePoint. Well, what do we get inside of SharePoint? So SharePoint Online gives us, from a storage perspective, we get initially 1 terabyte of storage plus 10 gigabytes per SharePoint Online license. So this is what the overall tenant storage can be. So again, looking at this instance here, we have 1 terabyte plus 10 gigs per SharePoint Online license. Now this could be a small amount of data, it could be a large amount of data. It depends on how many licenses you have. So that's the calculation as it stands. Now SharePoint Online, as I said, we can break it down into 2 different categories. Okay, there are 2 types of sites inside of SharePoint, and that's all we should ever really focus on. We have team sites and we have communication sites. Team sites are going to be collaborative. Communication sites are going to be publishing or content, publishing content, or again, communication side of things. So again, thinking about it as we want to more or less make this as a intranet type scenario here. That's what communication sites are for. Team sites are really for users getting together and collaborating on documents. Okay, and that's all we're going to really kind of leave it with there. We'll talk more about when we get to the communication side, but again, we're focusing on team sites only. We're going to look at this here in lab as well. Now, very similar to the way that OneDrive for Business works, the sync client is also the lifeblood of SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online allows us to sync document libraries, and those document libraries are essentially the locations inside of SharePoint sites. Okay, so we get document libraries there. Team sites have document libraries. Document libraries, as the name applies, are where all the documents go. So we could synchronize those document libraries with the OneDrive for Business sync client, which allows us to work, again, in a native Windows File Explorer experience. We can get our department shares and everything just as we did before. That's the purpose of the OneDrive for Business sync client. So this allows us to have a more native type experience and a more easily adopted user experience. So the OneDrive for Business client is just as important for OneDrive as it is for SharePoint. And again, we're going to look at that over time, how easy it is, really. It can be crazy. Now, if OneDrive for Business is tied to a user, SharePoint Online sites are tied to Microsoft 365 Groups, and let me move myself down there. They're tied to Microsoft 365 Groups, which persist after users leave the organization. Now, Microsoft 365 Groups are groups. Okay, they're security groups, they're communication groups, they're distribution groups. They're pretty much everything that Microsoft has kind of unified into one space. But a group is something that has tied many different things. Okay, so we have groups, we have the group, all right, and we'll just say accounting group. Well, accounting group may have a SharePoint team site, it may have a Yammer community, or it may have several different things attached to it. It may have an Exchange mailbox attached to it. It may have everything, but it's always attached to that group, all right? Users come and they go and they get added and they leave that group, but the group persists no matter what, which means the SharePoint data will also persist after individual users leave the organization. Those groups will stick around for as long as we allow them to. Now that's a key there. But again, those groups themselves are persistent. The users are not. Very important to understand the difference between the two. Now, The next piece that I want to start talking and getting into is around the permission side. Okay. So again, as we have done, we're going to look at legacy and we're going to look at modern. So permissions, when we're looking at permissions inside of a legacy file share here, well, what do? Well, we have SMB shares. They have a hierarchy permission model with or without inheritance. So again, it basically goes in a traditional file structure. We've seen this before. If you go to C drive, Windows, whatever, or it used to be my computer. Now we go to, C drive, computer, whatever it is. We have that structure in there as a hierarchy. So when we're looking at inheritance, so what we would do is we would put a permission set on the parent folder. Okay, so let's just say we said on the C drive, we gave Sally full access to everything on it. If we have inheritance enabled, every file inside of that hierarchy will inherit from the parent above it. It's just a hierarchy, so it'll inherit that. So Sally, vis-a-vis, will have access to every folder underneath of it. Now remember what I said before. When we potentially, most customers of mine have had a file share for decades, okay? So if you think about over time, we're adding little, hey, I need access to this file, or I need access to this location, whatever it may be. And you think about all the help desk calls that happen, all the little permissions, and all the little rules that, traditionally we say, no, you are not allowed to have access to it, but we give it access, get those extenuating circumstances, whatever it may be. What ends up happening is that we get a nightmare of permissions, okay? So this is essentially where we get this access control list here, but delegation and access control list is an absolute nightmare. Absolute nightmare. It becomes Swiss cheese, and I always call it a giant pile of spaghetti, and good luck finding it, because you may have 1,000 files, and I did this for a customer about a year ago. We were trying to look at the permission model of everything that they have in their permissions for their file share. And we say, okay, well, we ran a script on it, and it was taking about, probably about 3 weeks to run, and it kind of crapped out in the middle of it because it was just eating so much memory, and it just died in the middle of it. We couldn't do it. We could not get the permission level. So I kept going. I went by top folder. I pulled all the permissions for that. Then I jumped down to the next folder. That took long, and then I did down to 3. Those are the 3 levels. Top 3 levels I did. And I was starting to go through this, and I'm like, man, this does not make sense. I was like, I cannot get this. This is Swiss cheese is what this is. You have 1,000,000 permissions, individual permissions to individual sections. It's a nightmare, okay? So when we're looking at this here is we have a very hierarchy model. It's a hierarchical model, and it is very difficult to work through. Because it just works. And here's the problem is that, you really got to think about security when you're thinking about this too, is that there's some, for instance, like HR. Should everybody have access to HR? Well, of course not. And we have lots of different models around it. I've seen where we call like essentially an upside down pyramid. That's traditionally what we see, is that everybody will have access to everything at the top level, and then access gets essentially tighter as it goes down. Or we can do it the other way around, is essentially just kind of a standard pyramid where, you start off very light at the beginning, and then you have your access increase as it goes through. It really depends, but I'll be completely honest with you, it's a nightmare no matter what. Access control lists are probably one of the most complicated things that you can work through. So how do we essentially change this? What are our modern ways of doing it? Well, that's where our good old buddy, the Microsoft 365 group, comes into play. Okay, so let's just think about it here from this instance. We have accounting, we have the top level folders. We have accounting, we have HR, and we have IT. And I'm just going to make this very simple. So inside of there, we would have to say that, all right, well, maybe so-and-so needs access to something inside of accounting, and we got to have all this crosstalk between each other. And if you kind of map out a permission matrix, again, it looks like a giant pile of spaghetti. So Microsoft 365 groups are far different. Okay, this is one of the biggest challenges for organizations here, is to look at the permission matrix. Okay, this is all about flattening our permission model. Okay, so when we're flattening them, what we're doing here is that really there's a very simple hierarchy inside of files. Okay, so when we're looking at team sites, and I'm talking about SharePoint team sites, when we're looking at those, well, there's an owner, there are editor or contributor, if you will, and then you have viewer. So that's really about it when we're looking at what kind of levels do we get inside of there. Now, Microsoft recommends here in this instance is we never disable inheritance. We keep it flat as possible because this is much easier to manage. Yes, In the beginning, you're going to have a ton of groups. You're going to have a ton of sites. Yes, but over time, this will be much easier to manage because we can automate things. And we'll talk about that in time. Now, again, flattening this is as opposed to creating that pyramid or the reverse pyramid, the upside down pyramid, as I said, those two instances there. Let's forget about that. We're not going to worry about those. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at, as opposed to, a very complicated scenario, we're going to literally break that down to, all right, well, you look at these folders on here. So here is a site. Here are those folders, and that's all, and here you have access to it. The cool part about this here is that, again, we're going back to that empowerment scenario. How many times with a legacy model do people have to call IT, they have to submit a help desk or a request, hey, I need access to so-and-so, or so-and-so needs access to this. Can you give them to it? Whatever it may be. Well, in a modern model here, what we can do is I can give you access. You are the owner of this group. You can control who is allowed to be in and out of that group. So, and again, let's give you an example here. We have HR. HR has a let's just say we'll say a department head, okay? And the department head is John. And Sally says, hey, Billy over in accounting needs access to this. I need to essentially go through it. So, John has to go up and he has to submit a ticket to IT that says, hey, I approve of Billy to be able to have access to Sally's resource, okay? Whatever resources inside of our department share. Now, again, inefficiencies. This takes time. This takes effort. We have to go through a whole approval process, come back down. We have to wait for IT to actually do it, provision it. So we're talking days that could take, okay? But in a flattened model here, what we can do is that, John, you are the owner of this little subsection here of the accounting resource. You are the owner of it, okay? I'm going to assign you permissions to say you are owner of it and Sally is a member. Okay, Sally can fully interact with everything on there, but she has no permissions to add. So she says, hey, John, I need Billy to have access to it. John says, okay, Billy, access, done, good to go. We move on with our lives. It stops there. We're flattening that model out. John is the overall owner of that group, and Billy is now a member of it. So this is the purpose of flattening out our models because it's much easier to utilize over time. It's much easier to manage. It's much more secure. Nobody will ever be able to argue that this is insecure because it is not. This is far more secure than anything we can ever do with file shares on premise. Now, what else can a Microsoft 365 do? Well, let's look at it. It can consist of any of the following. Okay? We'll say any or. There's a lot. It could be, lots of different things. A SharePoint team site, an Exchange Online shared mailbox, a Microsoft team, a Yammer community. It doesn't necessarily, it can't have all of these, but it can have, especially when we're looking at team versus Yammer, it's generally going to be one or the other. But it will almost always have a SharePoint site and an Exchange Online shared mailbox. Why do we care about these? Well, we'll talk about these a little bit more as we go into it, where we're storing these things. Remember, there's only two places to store it, so we have SharePoint and Exchange. That's why one of these, or both of these, are always tied to a group. Now, in this instance here, remember when I said from a management perspective, now I can delegate a lot of the IT responsibilities out to users. These are more, John was given owner access because he's the department head. He knows, and he can make the final decision on that. The cool part is, too, is that, hey, if John ever tried to do anything malicious, we're auditing it all. We could see John added so-and-so at this time. This is what so-and-so did on these sites. It's really easy to do all of that stuff. So we're saving ourselves. We're empowering. What else can we do here? Well, we can do some automations around groups. So we may have 1 million groups out there, and that may be okay. But how many are active? Well, we don't know. Now we have to go through, do we have to script it and say, oh, when's the last time this person logged in? Hey, so-and-so, do you still use this group? Does it still need to stick around? No, we don't have to worry about that now. We can automate this piece now. As we can say that something through access reviews or potentially through something called just group expiration. Is that a group we can have expire every 180 days. We could choose whatever time we want. I always say about 180 because that is generally what we're looking at. For most customers is what I recommend. But again, looking at 180 days. So every 180 days, the owner of the group has to essentially, they'll get an email and they'll get a little pop-up in whatever, maybe it's SharePoint or maybe it's Teams, whatever it is. They'll open it up and say, they'll get an email that says, hey, you're the owner of a group. And do you still need access to this group? If you don't do anything and we'll automatically take care of it. Or if you do, just give us a thumbs up. That's really it. It's just an approval process. And they say, oh, okay, well, yeah, I need this still. I'm still working in it. We'll approve it. It gets approved, gets renewed for another 180 days. And they say, oh, no, I don't need it. They can just ignore the email and it'll automatically go about deprovisioning it and getting rid of the data and kind of getting rid of the group. Or they can actually go in and thumb down and say, I no longer need access, and then it will automatically deprovision and get rid of everything. So there's a lot of things we can do there. Don't worry about data. To you, I'm sure you probably immediately thought of, okay, well, if somebody just forgets to do it, what happens? We start deleting data. Don't worry about that. We're going to get to that in time. There is a time limit on all of this, and we got plenty of cushion. We got lots of tools to work with. We'll get to those in time. But for now, I want to give you an idea here of essentially where we have come from to where we are now. Groups, flattening our models, and essentially getting as much as we can of on-premise file shares is the modern way. And I'll be honest with you, file shares, they're never going to go completely away. Okay, they never will. There is always going to be use case scenarios for them for now where SharePoint or OneDrive or whatever just doesn't make sense. And that's fine. But if we can get as much as we can off of it, we are eliminating the usage of our users going over a VPN and accessing all of the data in the cloud. We can do that now just directly from our computer to the internet. We can use our security policies that we've worked at before. We can do so much. And the last piece I'm going to leave you on with here is I've always talked about internal collaboration. Well, what if we need to be able to share information with people on the outside? That's what we're going to be working with here in lab as well. So we'll talk more about that. So I've gone on enough about this collaboration side of things. There's much more to go with it, of course. But let's jump in and actually start playing around with these things here. So that'll be our next lab here where we're going to start playing around with SharePoint. We're going to look at OneDrive. We're going to install the sync client. We're going to configure sharings. We're going to see what the sharing experience is. So many different things that we're going to do there. But that's it for this particular lecture here, and I will see you over on the next one. Thank you for your time.